Hi, everyone. So we're now ready to go into our final session. And as I promised you, this was going to be a rousing finale, and I hope it is. Those of you who've been at our previous juvenile justice training programs know that we usually end our programs after 1 or 2 days with a roundtable where we bring all the fellows together for a discussion, frank discussion about the stories they're working on, issues they've had, sources they need, um, and um, and ask some questions of our experts and panelists about where they can go for more sources. It's been a great, very informal and very candid kind of interchange, and we're going to try to duplicate that as much as we can online in our Zoom webinars. And what we usually like to do is put on our some facilitators, and for that role we've always had Liz Ryan, who is the president and CEO of Youth First Initiatives, and many of you who've been at our sessions before know her well. Um, and she's a superb resource for all of you. And she's also been, by the way, a superb resource for us in planning this session. So, Liz, special thanks for helping us organize this. And I will first put Liz on. I've already got some questions ahead of time from some of the journalists, which I'll pose when we start our roundtable. But those of you who have others, feel free to post them in the Q&A section. So, Liz, if you want to turn on your video, there you are. Welcome to our webinar. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Stephen.
We also have a something we'll share the screen with you all on this.
Great. Well, should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, awesome. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all today. And I'm super excited to share with you just some ideas for stories for 2021. I know you've gotten a lot of good information from all of these webinars. So I'm just going to hit my top 10. So the first is really looking at the Biden administration and what they're going to be doing on juvenile justice. You may know that when Biden was running this past year, in the summer of 2019, he issued a platform on criminal justice and one on juvenile justice. So I think one of the stories to watch for 2021 is whether or not he's going to live up to what he put into that campaign platform on juvenile justice, and particularly things that, for example, would reverse the 1994 crime law, which dramatically increased the use of incarceration in the states. And his plans call for incentivizing states to reduce the use of incarceration. I think another story to watch for are the appointments, right? The appointments in Department of Justice, most particularly the Office of Juvenile Justice, which is the federal home for juvenile justice. The Obama administration waited 5 years to appoint an administrator for that office, and Trump appointed a very right-wing administrator from Liberty University that has issued some really punitive and regressive guidance. So that will be another one to watch. Who does the president-elect appoint for that role, and what's their orientation in terms of this work, progressive or regressive? A second story to watch for, and I know you are covering this probably every week, is what's happening with COVID-19. And both in terms of what the new administration is going to do on that, is their new task force that they just announced this week going to incorporate a look at what's happening inside the justice system as part of that COVID-19 response, and also what's going to keep happening in the states. The focus this fall has been on the election, right? So there hasn't been as much coverage in looking at what's happening inside correctional facilities. But as you know, we're heading into a phase where it's anticipated that cases are going to go up. And youth correctional facilities, just like nursing homes, just like cruise ships, they are petri dishes for the COVID. So that's something that I would encourage reporters to cover. What is your local detention facility or correctional facility doing on this? What's your governor doing on this? And then what is the new incoming president-elect going to do on this? A third story that I think is also critically important is about the Supreme Court. Now, you might recall that over the past 15 years, the Supreme Court has issued, a half dozen rulings that have essentially gotten rid of the harshest punishment for young people. So, for example, they struck down the death penalty for young people. They also struck down the life without the possibility of parole sentences for young people, except in murder cases where they believe there's no hope of rehabilitation. Now, just recently, a Mississippi case was heard before the Supreme Court, and a ruling is expected in this next court session. So the question on the table really is the court going to continue to move in the same direction that it has over the past 15 years, or is it going to reverse course given the new makeup of the court? Another important story that I think has not been covered at all is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. That law was reauthorized in 2018, at the end of 2018, and it was signed into law by President Trump. It was signed the same day as the First Step Act, so it didn't get any attention at all by media. And it is something that it's the only federal statute that governs juvenile justice in this country. And the states are in the process of implementing that law. And I think, it would be relevant to look at how are states implementing that? What are they doing in relation to the new law, and particularly the new provisions of the law that close a federal loophole in disallowing kids to be placed in adult jails pre-trial. There's been very limited coverage of that, so that the field is wide open on that one. Another important story, a trend story that I think, again, hasn't gotten much airtime is the fact that youth prosecuted in adult criminal court has dramatically decreased in the past 15 years, 10, 15 years. When I first came into the field 20 plus years ago in the late 90s, every state had passed laws to make it easier to try kids in adult criminal court. And in the past 15 years, there's been a slow reversal of that, right? We've seen law changes, more than 100 law changes around the country to get kids out of adult criminal court, to remove kids from adult jails, to remove kids from adult prisons. That trend story really hasn't been covered. And that's something that I think would be really important. Where's the line? Where is childhood and where does adulthood begin? Another story that I think has a whole bunch of stories attached to it is youth incarceration. We lead the world in incarcerating young people. We spend billions of dollars every year to do that. We are the world's largest incarcerator of children. And in the past 20 years, the numbers have gone dramatically down. Now, just because the numbers have gone down doesn't mean we're in a good place. What's happening is that we're not seeing these reforms equally benefit all kids. So African-American youth, and other youth of color are the proportion of youth of color in the system is actually going up. The racial and ethnic disparities is going up. The costs of incarcerating kids is going up. Now, in the time of COVID, we've seen a number of facility closures, right? And even prior to that. So jurisdictions are getting creative on this. They're getting rid of these facilities. They're repurposing them. They're trying to find other ways to serve youth in their communities. Now, it's a trend that's got some nuances to it. But I think that, looking at that trend, looking at the cost, looking at the disparities would all be relevant stories, and also going deep in a few states. I mean, we have states like California where the governor's proposed getting rid of all the youth prisons. Sort of on the progressive end. And then we have states like Florida that, you can literally open up a newspaper in Florida on any given day and see, abuses of incarcerated kids. And it's really horrific in that state. So those are things that could and should be looked at. Related to that are the use of private prisons and private facilities in the youth justice system. We don't use those facilities as much as the adult system. However, in the places where we do use them, for example, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas, California, there have been some horrific abuses. And earlier this year, a young man named Cornelius Fredericks died in a facility in Michigan because he threw a sandwich and a staff person restrained him and held him, and he died. And so that organization, the for-profit sequel company that runs that, was kicked out of Michigan because of that. But sequel is still all over the country in many states. So that's something that, getting ahead of the story, ahead of what these private prisons are doing would be really beneficial. Several more stories to highlight. Fees and fines. In the youth justice system, there are fees and fines embedded in every aspect of the system. And these fees and fines fund a bunch of different things in the system. They sometimes fund the use of juvenile defense attorneys. Sometimes they fund a specific, program. These fees and fines are things that push families further into poverty. So, for example, every state in the US permits or requires parents to be charged for the incarceration of their children. There's been some impact on trying to repeal these fees and fines, and those have gotten limited coverage in the state. So I think we're starting to see a trend here. That's an emerging trend, something to look at. The last two issues that I want to raise are girls in the justice system. Girls enter the system in a much different way than boys do. Paternalistic judges lock up girls, quote, for their own protection. Cops arrest girls under the mandatory arrest laws that were incentivized under the Violence Against Women Act. So we've seen girls coming into the system for different reasons. That said, the number of girls is actually decreasing, so much so that you have facilities that could hold 100 girls to have 5 or 6 girls in them. So it really begs the question of whether girls should be locked up at all. And the last story I want to raise is something that's just kind of a sleeping story. I haven't seen it anywhere really, but juvenile probation, it was created more than 100 years ago. It's designed to support youth in their communities. But unfortunately, it's the largest driver of incarceration, right? So if a young person violates their probation, one of the sanctions in many, many jurisdictions is to send that kid to a lockup. Correctional facility. And so this issue has received virtually no attention by press. So that's my top 10, and happy to talk about it, happy to answer questions.
These are great, Liz. Before we go on to Tina, I wanted to mention, first of all, that Liz has also prepared a resource list for all these stories and more, which is really rich in URLs and resources. And we will, I'll send those to you guys after the session is over, and also a reprise of the top 10 list that we've just shown on the screen with a little bit more detail. And we will go on, by the way, we're scheduled to stop this afternoon at 4:15, but with the indulgence of Tina and Liz, we can go as late as 4:30 or so. So those of you who want to stay on and ask more questions, feel free, we'll be here. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Tina Rosenberg, who's also been deeply involved in our roundtables. Most of you know Tina as the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. She's also co-author of the Fixes column in the New York Times, and she's written hundreds of magazine articles and books, one of which won the Pulitzer. So, Tina, welcome to the webinar, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. I will start my video. There we go. Hi. Okay. Thank you, Steve and Joe and Chris and Emily for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with the journalists in these symposia. So I appreciate the chance to do that. So I want to build on what Liz's extremely interesting and valuable presentation for journalists of story ideas to talk about how we can actually take those and turn them into stories that we can do, and that, as someone asked in the questioning for Holly and Marcia, how can we do something that our readers will be able to get their arms around and get interested in? And I want to suggest that one way of doing that, not the only way, but it's an arrow we should keep in our quiver and take out whenever necessary, is doing solutions journalism. So Liz didn't just give us 10 ideas, she gave us dozens of ideas, because everything she said can be sliced into smaller pieces. The issue of fees and fines has many, many sub-issues. The issue of the Supreme Court and juvenile justice has many, many sub-issues. And you're probably not going to want to tackle the whole thing. You're going to want to take a small part of it that's still important to your coverage area and do that. But let me share my screen so we can slideshow. You all seen that? My first slide, solutions journalism, telling the whole juvenile justice story. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, fantastic. So these are just a couple of stories that, first of all, I'll provide this PowerPoint to anybody who wants it, so you can have that. A couple of stories that are ways of getting into the issues that Liz talked about. This is a piece, How Philadelphia Flipped, Second Chances for Youth, about cutting off the school to juvenile justice pipeline. Here's another one. What happens when a school stops arresting kids for throwing Skittles? It's about a school that changed its approach to school discipline and what the effects of that were. This is about fees and fines. In Kansas, a African-American focused news organization has been doing a series about the price of being poor, and one of these was about fees and fines and what happened when forget which state it was they were talking about. It wasn't, I don't think it was Kansas. They stopped suspending people's license for non-payment of fines and how that allowed people to go back to work. So this is a piece in WBEZ in Chicago, what San Francisco's reform of fees and fines can teach Chicago. And it's an example of a tale of two cities. What is another city doing that our city can learn from? This is a very common way of doing a solutions journalism story. This is about COVID and prisoners, not necessarily juvenile, but why did 77 Ohio prisoners die of COVID? I'm sure the number is more now because this was the end of August. Only 10 in Pennsylvania. What did Pennsylvania do that Ohio didn't do? Another example of a tale of two states in this case. What to do with youth prisons. Here's a shuttered youth prison and what they did with it and what happened as a result. This is one about the issue of trying juveniles as adults. This is a juvenile who actually was 2 months too old to be considered a juvenile. So he's serving life in prison, whereas everybody else that he committed his crime with got a much, much lighter sentence. And what happened to change that? And then about girls, there's many different issues about girls and juvenile justice system. And you can look at a place that has tried to do something different and what results they've gotten. So what you see here is an approach that looks at who's doing a better job. And in the course of that, you are talking about the problem. Solution stories are not just about a response to a problem. They always also cover the problem. And good solutions journalism covers the response in a critical and rigorous way. You are not giving people the impression that it's all fine now. You're really putting the thing in context and saying, this is what somebody tried. Here is the results they've gotten. But we also see the larger context of what this problem is and what the challenges still are that they face and what are the reasons, what are the obstacles to replicating that elsewhere. So if you do it right, this is very serious journalism that does not make people think, oh, it's been solved. Instead, it gives them a way into thinking about this that is less depressing. And we know that the biggest reason people tune out from engaging with the news is how depressing it is. So here's another one, sorry. Another youth prison that was turned into something different, this time a sustainable farm that is an alternative form of juvenile justice in North Carolina. Youth courts, another alternative to the traditional justice system. So there's lots of different stories that allow you to access the issues that Liz is talking about in a way that you can take a bite out of and that your audiences can engage with and understand. Another one, boy, I have a lot of these. Yes, a Milwaukee story about what New York is doing to help youth transition after incarceration. Okay, so I'm from the Solutions Journalism Network. We're a 7-year-old organization. It grew out of a column in the New York Times, Fixes, that Steve mentioned, that my co-founder and I still write to this day every week. But Solutions Journalism Network promotes the idea that journalists should not just cover problems, but should also cover what is being done to try and solve those problems. Not as PR, not as cheerleading, not as advocacy, but as real journalism. So one of the things that we have many, many tools on our website, but one of the most useful is our solution story tracker. We collect solution stories from all over the place. We now have more than 10,000, and you can search for them by all sorts of different issues. If you want a video that's between 5 and 15 minutes long on solitary confinement in Colorado, you can find all of those. So it's an extremely useful way of looking at what stories have been written, what are the issues out there that I might not know about, and what are the approaches that other folks have taken. I used to talk about this at the beginning of my workshops, and then I stopped. I think I might have made a mistake now because people would just tune me out and then go play with the story tracker. So I want you to hold off on that a couple of minutes, but it is a lot of fun to play with. So this is an example of the power of solutions journalism. I'm going to race right through this. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had done several stories on the issue of lead poisoning. With no real effect. So they decided to do another series that we at SJN helped them with, which looked at lead poisoning through the issue of race. And here's what one of the reporters who worked on it said. I'll let you read that. So lots of blah, blah, but the series had done nothing to keep local officials from saying, hey, this is a difficult problem and we're doing the best we can, which is very often a response from local officials. So we helped them do a series that started with a traditional investigative piece, but also did some solution stories. And these stories had the effect of increasing accountability by taking a problem that leaders could have dismissed as unavoidable and making it seem unacceptable. And the reason it was unacceptable is that our neighbors are doing better. And this was a letter from the editor introducing the series. We're going to look at what our neighbors are doing and what's keeping Cleveland from adopting these smart solutions. So they went to Rochester, New York, which overall was doing better on the issue of lead poisoning, and they did a piece on what Rochester had done in depth. They took little bite-sized pieces of it, and I like the strategy a lot. Lots of cities around the Midwest had done a part of it well, and they looked at that. What was Akron doing? What was Grand Rapids doing? Various other cities on pieces of the problem that were important. And they published a chart in the paper. I love this. Here's what successful cities do, and here's what Cleveland does. And you can imagine how this is profoundly embarrassing to public officials in a way that simply reporting on the problem is not. So it had, I'm not going to go into the impact, it had a lot of immediate impact. The city and the state doubled the staff, doubled the budget, adopted many of the best practices seen elsewhere. And finally, last summer, the city council passed a complete overhaul of the lead poisoning prevention law. So that's an example of the power that solutions journalism can have. So a lot of powerful solutions journalism stories use something called the positive deviant. Liz's resource list is a fantastic resource, and a lot of it is data, or allows you to look up data. And one way of using that data is to see who's doing better. And what are they doing? Then you look into that. You do your reporting. What did Tulsa County do that the rest of Oklahoma did not do? So the advantages of doing stories this way are it has much more legitimacy. You know, because this is the top of the list, or it's the top of the list that's demographically similar to us, that there's a reason I'm reporting on this. And my job is just to find out how. What were the steps they took that others have not been able to take? And what's keeping others from doing that? SJN again. And here's the 4 qualities of a solutions journalism story. It is not just about a person, although all stories have people in them. The real hero of the story is the response to the problem and how it happened. Second, it looks at evidence of results, looking at effectiveness and not just intentions. Third, it's not just inspirational. It's not just a fun human interest story. It provides insights that are useful to society. And fourth, make sure you talk about the limitations. What takes it out of press release land is saying, here's what's not working about it. There's no such thing as a perfect program. You'd have no credibility if you claimed there was. So you might as well embrace what doesn't work about it. You're writing about it because it's a good story, not because it's perfect. And talk about what's not working about that. So I will I will leave this for later if we want to talk about that and just open it up right now. Back to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Tina. So I have a whole bunch of questions from journalists, some of them which they want me to pose and others which I'd like them to pose themselves so we can get a little bit of back and forth. I'm waiting to get one of them on the screen, David Dudley, but before I go to him, it's a question first from Eddie Burkhalter, who's one of our fellows, who actually has two questions for both of you. He's asking for advice on navigating what he describes as privacy matters when you're covering youth in the justice system. This is a constant issue, obviously, when we're covering minors. Perhaps you in particular, Lisa, can respond to that. And another interesting question is, where might I find the best data and sources available on the finances behind the justice system? That's a huge issue, which actually not a lot of people write about. So I'll leave that open as a start.
So just a couple things on the privacy. I mean, the juvenile justice system was founded on the premise that kids are different from adults, and that focusing on rehabilitation, and that kids are capable of rehabilitation. So one of the central things about juvenile justice is confidentiality. I think that confidentiality at times has been used to shield bad things happening in the system now. So I think that there is a balance. You can write stories about what's happening in the system without having to disclose the identity of the individual that you're writing about, or writing about an individual or a family without disclosing a last name, or using a pseudonym, or using a first name only, or even just I know you don't like to use names anonymously, but I think that the thing that you have to remember is that there is a serious threat of retaliation against anybody who talks to you who is incarcerated, or they have a family member incarcerated, or if they're still on paper, if they're on probation in any way. So you don't want your story to result in that kid getting locked up again, or something bad happening to that kid. So I think the way for you to think about it is can you tell the story without disclosing identifying features about that young person? So that's my recommendation on that. Then on the data, on the finances, that is an untold story. You've hit a gold mine covering that. There are a couple different sources for that. One is to go to, if you're looking at nationally, where is their resource, going into the justice system from the feds. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention is the main source of federal funding. However, there are other sources. So if you're looking at a specific state, what I would recommend is that you contact the JJ specialist, who is the designated person in that state who's supposed to be tracking what's happening with all of the federal resources coming in for juvenile justice, as well as practice and policy. So that's one source. A second source is, what is your state spending, right? So if you go to your state budget and you look at what the Department of Juvenile Justice is, and in every state it's slightly different. If you're having trouble finding it, let me know. I'm happy to share that info with you. Find out what the state is spending. And then there's also money at the local level, right? The counties, there's county detention, there's county courts. There's a lot of resource that goes in at the county level too. So I've never seen somebody do an entire look at all the money that goes into this. I think that study would take a very long time to do. But I think if you were to pick one locality in a state, like a county, you could look at the county money, the state money coming into the county, and the federal money coming into the county, and you could get a pretty good snapshot of what is spent. There's an organization called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and they have worked with some of their state affiliates to look at what those dollars look like. I think they'd be a terrific resource for you on the data piece for finance.
Only story I've seen so far to do with finances is the cost of incarcerating kids, which of course is tremendous, and that's but that's been out there, and you're right, is a gold mine when we look at the other areas. And
that looks at, I will say that Justice Policy Institute did a fantastic report this past year, and has looked at the costs of incarceration, and what they're looking at there is, when a kid is committed to the juvenile justice system, what are the average costs to incarcerate kids? So that's one piece. It is the largest single chunk of money that goes into the juvenile justice system, if you look at any state budget on that. So it's a helpful resource, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. It does tell a big chunk of it, though.
Thank you, Liz. Let me move quickly to Shabnam Danish, and or Dinesh, and he's online, so let's put him on screen. She's online. Sorry, Shabna.
Hi, how are you? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for these presentations have been wonderful. I just had a question more along the lines of mental health. I'm interested in seeing how mental health plays a part in the youth progressing through the juvenile justice system, and how that mental health may progress into something more significant as a result of being in detention.
Thank you, Shabnam. I think that's a question both of you guys might answer. First, Liz, and then maybe Tina with some examples of solutions, stories, if you'd like.
Yeah, I think a couple things on the mental health aspect of this is that the mental health system, children's mental health, there's very little resource going into that, into the community. So a lot of kids get dumped into the juvenile justice system because there isn't enough community mental health supports for kids. So you see that all over the place. You see kids also in juvenile detention centers awaiting placement in a mental health facility. So it's part of the problem here is that there haven't been enough resources invested in children's mental health in the community. And that's one of those to look at would be the Medicaid EPSDT requirements, which have largely gone unfulfilled in many states. I will say that there is not consensus in the field around this. There are a lot of folks who think that kids, there's a high number of kids with mental health issues in the juvenile justice system. I think that that's a question, right? It's a question to me whether those mental health issues were pre-existing issues or whether being locked up in a cell for 24 hours a day and not being able to see your family and being treated like a dog,
Exactly.
being fed under the door, whether that exacerbates or creates mental health issues. So you'll see the data on this varying widely around this. A couple of resources for you. The National Alliance of the Mentally Ill, NAMI, has chapters in states. They are very active on these issues. I would talk with them. Another group that I would talk to would be National Disability Rights Network, because they have advocates in every state that go into facilities and work with people who have disabilities, many of whom have, some of them have mental health, experiencing mental health issues. Those would be two things that I'd look at.
Awesome. Thank you.
Tina, do you want to chime in?
Sure. I would say that there are solution stories I've seen at various pieces along the spectrum. For example, many school systems are changing the way they do school discipline so that, for example, expulsion of preschoolers has been a huge issue. You'd be shocked at how many preschoolers get expelled, and imagine the track that sets you on at the age of 4. But instead of doing that, now many schools are giving those kids mental health treatment and training their teachers to deal with them in a way that promotes their mental health. So there's a lot of school-based mental health programs. Additionally, a lot of police departments now are working with mental health experts. The highest propensity for police violence is in a mental health call. And so many police departments and sheriff's departments are having those calls answered by police and a mental health expert or just a mental health expert. Nobody ever got better in jail. We definitely know that. But there's other parts of the justice spectrum where mental health intervention is also important.
Thank you.
Tina.
I had one other question as well,
Sure.
more in regards to the youth private prisons, and they're notoriously secretive. So I didn't know if you had any tips or tricks to breaking down and getting them to actually shed some information.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've raised an issue that has been really challenging, right? Like I actually tried to take a group of foundations to visit a private youth prison, and they would not even respond to me. But let me give you some ideas. So the first is to look at who has the contract with that private prison. Is it the state? Is it another oversight agency? And to try to go in that door. Another door is what kind of resources, look at the finances. Are there any federal dollars? Are there any state dollars going in to fund that private prison? You could be looking at state, juvenile justice money. You could be looking at, do they provide Medicaid funded services there? So try to find where the money's coming from. Another way to get in is through the Prison Rape Elimination Act, because they do audits of every facility every 3 years. And so talk to the PREA auditor in your state. There's a PREA resource center where you can find out who is the auditor, who are the auditors in your state. Another idea is to try to find a whistleblower or former staff person. These places are notorious for paying low wages, and so they have high turnover. You could actually go to outside the facility on visitation day, and also try to talk to families who might be there. You know, there might be a McDonald's nearby or a restaurant nearby where families are waiting to go see their loved ones, and try to talk to family members. Another is to try to find people who are contractors with that organization, right? So there's educators that often will come in that are not, they don't work for the private prison, they work for the state or the county educational agency, and they are often a good source of whistleblowers. Another one is to look at Yelp. People put reviews of the food inside these facilities on Yelp, and you might be able to find something there. One more idea is to look at who are the investors in that prison, and to go after the investors. I know that's been something that Color of Change, which is a really terrific national advocacy organization, has done, as have other folks looking at that. So that may be another entry point in.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
They might necessarily get you into the facility,
Right.
but they'll get you information about it that you can expose and then raise questions.
Great. Thank you.
I know of one case where someone
Yeah.
has gotten into private prisons, and it's very unusual. L.B. Eisen, who's director of justice programs at the Brennan Center, did a Fixes column. She had written a book on private prisons, and she took a trip to New Zealand and Australia, where they are experimenting with private prisons that are structured differently. Instead of being paid by the inmate, so they have incentive to spend as little as possible, they are being paid to prevent recidivism. And by restructuring the financial incentives for those prisoners, they gave them the financial incentive to do much better by those prisoners, to pay their guards better, to have more humane treatments, to have educational programs. Very, very different way of doing private prisons. I don't know if it exists in the United States, but she got in. Obviously, it's easier to do that if they're convinced you're actually going to write something nice about them. Very rare with private prisons, but.
I mean, the other way to go in is to do what Shane Bauer did. He's
Yeah.
a reporter. Go in a like a Brubaker type fashion, you know, where you go in as someone who's in the facility.
Yeah.
But that's difficult to do, especially in a youth facility.
Yeah. Don't exactly look like a kid.
Or
In an adult facility, maybe. But,
Exactly.
I think he tried it, and now that he's tried it, people are going to be extra alert to that happening again. So.
Yeah.
So I see David Dudley on our screen, but I don't know if he's there. David, are you there? If you are, you can unmute yourself. There he is. David, hi. You can ask your question.
There we are. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes, we do.
Great. All right. Well, actually, my question was right along those lines. You know, how do I find people to talk to? How do I get people to open up? Because it's under lock and key. And right now, you know, one of the stories I'm working on is, and I got the idea from this fellowship. I would really like to get with some young people who have been incarcerated. And I would also like to get with some young people who have been through restorative justice programs. Young people who have similar records, but who will have obviously had very different experiences because of those arrests. And I would like to see what were their experiences like. Did one process work better than the other? Does it save money as opposed to the other? But I'm struggling to find sources that are willing to go on record right now.
David, are you looking in a specific state or all
So
over?
I'm in southern Utah right now, St. George, Utah. And I've only been here for 10 days, so you know, I'm still very early in the process. But they're also, you know, I'm certain that the dynamics are very different here. You know, I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and I'm from a very poor neighborhood, so I could take a walk around the block and find people. Here, you know, it's like, where do I even look? But as of last week, I've started to reach out to various community organizations, and you know, I've let them know what I'm interested in doing, and asked if they can hook me up with parents, because I feel like the parents might be the way to go, because obviously I can't reach the young people directly.
Well, you could look in every single state, there are advocacy organizations that are working on reform issues that you could talk to. And there's also groups that provide services, direct services to kids who are in the justice system. One way you could start is to contact the juvenile justice specialist in Utah, that person, and ask them for a list of the grantees, money that their state advisory group and their state gives to organizations that work with kids in the justice system. You could also look at the Utah Department of Juvenile Justice, look at their budget, look at who they fund, see if they have a list of organizations that they fund, and then reach out to them directly and to try to see if you can have conversations with folks who are connected to those programs. I think in terms of talking to kids who are incarcerated, that's just going to be hard to do. I'm just being completely realistic about that. But there are ways to get connected to them. So for example, if you went to your local Disability Rights Network member. So if you go to National Disability Rights Network and you look up the Utah member, contact the Utah member, and they have unfettered access to facilities. They can go in at any time to see their clients. And so they may be willing to take a letter in from you or to bring information out or to have their client call you, as long as there's some confidentiality there. And then I mean, what I say is, like, find out when visitation day is at the facility. And oftentimes there's a bus that picks up people in one town and brings them to the facility. And you can meet the bus on the front end or on the back end and talk to families. I'd be happy to try to figure out who else in Utah I could connect you with. I'd have to kind of look at my database, but I could probably send you some contacts.
I would appreciate that very much. Yeah.
Thank you, David. The next question is an audio question only. I'd like to turn it over to Judy Ellich. I'm going to allow her to talk. Judy?
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask some questions I thought of early on, but I've been listening to everything what you've said, and I found it interesting that you talked about following the money, and you look at where the money's coming from, and our juvenile detentions have been closed in this area. And my thought is how do you, are the kids actually being placed into programs, or are they being shipped to another detention center far away where their family, who can barely afford to pay the money to call them or have them call them, can't make that trip? Which, of course, now we're getting into what you guys were talking about, and everybody was talking about the mental health, the isolation from a family, the fear of not knowing what's going to happen when you get out, because you don't understand COVID-19 because you're isolated from everything. So I was just thinking about that. Do you want to talk about that? I mean, how can I, as a journalist, approach that, or anybody?
Judy, and on your question, just so I understand it, are you talking about, I'm not sure I totally understand your question. Is your question?
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Is it about, whether or not what's happening with that particular closure of that detention facility, what's happening to kids as a result of that?
Yes, that's part of it. And are they truly being brought into programs, or are they being taken to another facility far away? And that is a problem with their families, especially families who are tight with money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is happening more and more around the country as facilities close. I would start with the county officials, right? Whoever the elected officials are who have oversight over the juvenile detention center. And in some cases there's an advisory body, in other cases there's an oversight board. And then, if they don't have that, you could look at who is actually, who's the elected official in charge of that. In some cases also it's an appointed official. And I would find out, I'd ask them for their data, right? How many kids are in community-based programs, how many kids are being sent out of state. And if you can't get that data, I'd FOIA for that data, because they have to have that data. Sometimes the courts will have that data too, depending on the jurisdiction. So that's another source, is to go to them. I think that that's happening more and more. Now, in terms of connecting with the families, I think you'd have to kind of work it backwards from, where are the kids ending up, and then going to those facilities and trying to figure out how you can connect with the families. There are some advocacy groups in wherever, jurisdictions around the country. A lot of them work at the state level, but then there are local groups that advocate on behalf of young people and families in the system. So depending on the state, you may be able to connect with those advocates, kind of put the word out that you're interested in talking with families. I think more and more you'll find families are interested in talking with media, but sometimes they don't want you to report their name if their kid is still locked up.
Just to follow up on the data point, we have two good questions related to data. One from Anna Brugman, and that directly is to Tina, really, and another one from Julie Reynolds Martinez. But let me read the question out so we can go a little bit faster. This is from Anna, who says that so much solutions journalism relies on data, but we've already discussed how much data, particularly on race and gender, isn't collected. So what are some other metrics we might use to indicate the efficacy of a solution other than traditional data sets? Anna has another larger question about solutions journalism, but I'll hold that for a moment.
I think that first one's a Liz question. I don't know enough about juvenile justice to be able to answer that.
Okay.
I mean, a couple things that I would say about that. The best quality control over programs for kids are the kids. Ask the kids. Ask them, what do they think of that program? They'll tell you. Will find out more by talking to a group of young people, and maybe if you provide some pizza or food while you're doing that, that can also be an incentive. But I think that oftentimes the young people who are directly impacted by this are never asked about what those programs do. I also think that we should be asking about child well-being, not just data. Like oftentimes the youth justice system's data sets are very regressive. It's like, did that kid reoffend? Did that kid get arrested again? I mean, it's like they're very negative, as opposed to like, has that young person, attained the next grade? How is their health? How's their mental health? Like, how are they growing and thriving in school? So I think that there's some sort of more positive metrics that you can ask about. And I think you can try to talk with young people in the system. And I mean, you could even go directly to the system to say, hey, I'd like to host a conversation with people about these programs and get a sense of, what these are like, or to do a survey. You could even do a confidential survey of some kind.
Are there specific, I just want to follow up with a question from Julie Reynolds Martinez, and I'll let you follow up in a second. She asked that where can we find federal or state level data about juvenile sentencing reforms, such as how many young people have been impacted, had their sentences reduced, and what savings resulted from that?
So there's a whole bunch of different data places. So, and I put a few of them on the data, on the little toolkit that I'm sending around. One is that usually courts will have a lot of this information. There are it's called a state statistical analysis center that every state has. They get federal funding to collect this kind of data. I put a link to that in the reporter toolkit that you can click on and find stuff in your states. There is also, I think in a lot of places, there may be universities that may collect this information. There are also a few national groups like the Sentencing Project, the Justice Policy Institute, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Vera Institute. All of those organizations collect data and talk about trends. And there are also advocates who do that as well. So like Campaign for Youth Justice collects information about what's happened with laws that prosecute kids in adult criminal court. The Juvenile Law Center looks at laws related to expungement or confidentiality of juvenile records and fees and fines. So there's a whole bunch of groups that track these. And then there's another source called the JJGPS, which is the National Center for Juvenile Justice, which has traditionally been a contractor with the feds and has collected a lot of data. They have this thing called JJGPS, where you can go to that and find a ton of data about individual states and then where they rank compared to other states on that particular topic.
Sometimes if you can't get comparative data, you can get change over time in a particular area. If a jurisdiction made a certain reform, look at what was true before the reform and what's true after the reform.
Okay, Anna Brugman has another question, which is more oriented towards a solicitor journalism question. So I'm going to give her the mic and allow her to talk. Anna, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you both so much for coming and chatting with us. This is really useful. I've been a big solutions journalism fan for a very long time, and so this is very fun. But I'm really interested in, when we talk about stakeholders and how important it is when we talk about solutions to talk to the people who the problem affects. And I think we've said it a couple times in this session, the people who the problem affects are sometimes hard to reach. And so what other voices should we incorporate in stories and reporting about youth justice that are A, affected by youth justice, but sometimes not represented in the reporting? And B, what are some other stakeholders we can talk to if we can't get those youth voices in our stories?
It's a good question. I mean, it's hard to reach kids in incarceration. I'd say it's relatively easy to find them after they get out. And again, if you don't need to use their real names, it makes life a lot easier. But formerly incarcerated youth is one. Their families is another. Teachers, another. Local organizations that work with formerly incarcerated people, maybe for job training and things like that.
Okay, so another question we have is from April Kelly, and I'd like to pass the mic over to her. She's got some complicated questions, so I'll let her describe them. April, the mic is yours if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great.
Yeah, so I have found that some of my FOIA requests kind of end up in what I call a FOIA void in more rural, like in the South areas. Like I will request information by mail because there's no electronic way to do so. And then it's almost like I never, ever hear anything ever again. And I was wondering if that's something a lot of people encounter and how I can kind of maybe get information otherwise or what I can do.
Is that to anyone in particular or to both?
Anyone who wants to answer.
I mean, one thing I would suggest is to keep track, obviously when you send a FOIA request in, the law specifies a certain period of time by which they must respond. And if over time, it keeps getting ignored, I'd go to the local elected officials and start to ask them. I know, I will just tell you, I'm not a journalist, but when the Obama administration came in and I put in a FOIA request to get information from the Office of Juvenile Justice, it got ignored. And then what I started doing is every month I would hit reply all, and then I would start adding congressional staff to it. And finally, when I got to the committee staff for the Senate Judiciary Committee, I mean, I got the box the next day from the feds. I mean, they were just clearly sitting on it for no reason. So I do think shedding some light on it by, local elected officials, you need to make sure they know that this request has gone in. And sometimes they're the better requester, at least from the advocacy end. I don't know what reporters should do on that, but from the advocacy end, I will go to the committee chair, or if there's an oversight body for that particular agency.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see Isaac Scherer is on the screen. I don't know if Isaac wants to put a screen on. I can certainly unmute him if Isaac can hear it. Isaac, can you hear me? Hang on. I'll promote him to panelist and see if he can get up. Okay, while we're waiting for him, let me go to Charlotte West. She has a question, and I'm going to find her in. There she is. Allow her to talk. Charlotte, can you hear me? Oh, Charlotte, you are using an older version of Zoom. I'm going to promote you to panelist, which will get you on the screen. There you go. Charlotte, hello.
Hi, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I've been playing around with a few different story ideas related to juvenile justice and education. I think one was sort of looking at what's happening. I know we've all sort of heard the story about Grace, and I've heard from some I guess advocates here in the Bay Area who were talking about, you know, that this was an issue, that students who are on probation are being held to higher standards than you know, their peers who are not on probation. And I just wanted to see if you have any suggestions about how to find those local stories, either through lawyers or the people I talked to here say that it's been happening, but they couldn't find specific cases or, you know, young people to talk to. I guess the other story idea that I've been playing around with is this idea of financial aid for currently and formerly incarcerated juveniles. And in California, the California Aid Commission has actually clarified that students in juvenile facilities are not considered incarcerated, they're considered confined, so they are eligible for the Cal Grant program. But I guess I've also been struggling with that piece because it's a little bit in the weeds. So I wonder if it's maybe part of a broader story on kind of access to higher education. So I'd love your thoughts around that.
Before either of you answer, I just want to also mention that if any of you who are in the chat room have a comment to make about what any of your colleagues are saying or a suggestion, just raise your hand and I'll put you on the screen or put you on audio. Okay. Who wants to answer, Charlotte?
So Charlotte, a couple things. With the federal financial aid, you know, there were rule changes, or I guess clarification, that kids in the juvenile justice system were eligible for Pell Grants, and there was a lot of advocacy around that. There's an organization run by David Domanick, and it's called the Center for Educational Excellence in Alternative Settings. David ran the correctional sort of school in DC and did an amazing job, and now advises other jurisdictions around the country. He would be a terrific source of to talk to about that, and also to connect you with any of the schools that they're doing work with. On the probation piece, can you clarify a little bit more about what you're looking for there?
So, I mean, I was someone from the Youth Law Center, and what she was saying is that, you know, students are being penalized, you know, students on probation are being penalized for not attending online school, for example, but it might be because of Wi-Fi issues or tech access. But then they're being penalized for not being able to attend class when it's in some cases outside their control, where, you know, versus peers who are not on probation who can't, you know, I think we've seen statistics between 20 and 30% of some students in some districts right now are not actually going to online school. So I guess it's just they're being held to this higher standard, like you must attend school, but there are all these external factors. So I guess I'm just curious, like what's the best way to go about reporting that story? And in some cases they're potentially being reincarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, you're in the Bay Area, right?
Correct.
So what you might do there is, you know, something Tina had suggested earlier about like just going directly to a local group that works with young people who are on probation and talking with them. So there's an amazing group called the Young Women's Freedom Center that's actually run by young women who are in the justice system, and they have a whole bunch of young people who are part of that. There's another group called Courage, Communities United to Restore Youth Justice, and that's another, you heard of them. They're another group that you could talk with that work with young people. And then for you and for anybody else who's looking to find like who are the groups that work with young people and do advocacy on this, there's a great organization called the National Juvenile Justice Network. njjn.org. And if you go on their website, you can click on any state and a list of contacts come up. And again, those are the advocacy groups. Some of them work directly with young people, some don't, but they know everybody in their state. And so they are very interested in getting these issues covered, and I think could be a great help with you. One other group to talk to would be, I would talk to Nate Bayless, who is the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group Director at the Annie Casey Foundation. They have a whole initiative on probation reform. And so, maybe putting your story in the context of probation reform. I mean, probation is supposed to help kids in the community, and that's really screwed up that it's actually increasing or furthering kids' entrance into incarceration. So I would talk to Nate, and they have, I think, a network of people through this JDAI network where they could put you in touch with like a system leader who cares about this and who could talk about this from the perspective of what's supposed to be happening in the system or reforms that they've undertaken.
Okay, I want to put Isaac Scher on. He's on audio as well. So Isaac, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, everyone. So recently I've been looking into what it's kind of, at this point, it's not guaranteed, but it's a working hypothesis, which is that in the youth justice system, but also more broadly in the criminal justice system, we're seeing kind of what's being described as an alternative to pretrial detention. So I'm working squarely in the pretrial space right now. And as we're seeing like a relative decrease in the use of money bail, one alternative is electronic monitoring and pretrial release with what probation officers describe to me as, quote, conditions and supports. In reality, I'm of course skeptical of that, of surveillance devices on one's person and one's home. I think it's cause for concern. And I also think that as the bail industry faces threats by reformists around the country, that actually what we might be seeing is a new market opening up in companies that provide, drug tests, ankle bracelets, home cameras, things like that. And so actually my question is, what are your recommendations for investigating these companies? I mean, I've spoken to a few people who have said basically, yeah, there's no real aggregate data on these companies. I've done a little bit of searching myself for government contracts. I know of only right now just a single academic actually who happens to have her own working archive. But I'm curious about what it would mean to collect a representative sample of how this market might be growing and market shares and stuff like that.
There are several people I would suggest talking to if you haven't already. James Kilgore, I think, is the leading national expert on electronic monitoring and has written reports about this and research. I would definitely reach out to him. Another group that's worked on this that has done research looking at like mass incarceration. We don't want to replace mass incarceration with mass surveillance, right, or mass supervision. So Prison Policy Initiative, Peter Wagner's group is also looking at this. And then there's a group called Worth Rises, a woman named Bianca Tylek who runs that. And they are looking specifically into finances of all of these kinds of companies. So she would be a tremendous resource for you.
Thank you very much. I've actually been in touch with a few of them, so I'll keep going on that.
We have there's one question I don't want to let go, which is really directed to Liz. Is that are there some state-specific stories that you think and issues that journalists need to explore? For instance, minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction. There's now a movement to raise the age beyond 18. In some of the states to as much as 20, and there's federal funding to state advisory groups under threat. At least it was under the Trump administration when they threatened to cut funding because New York was a sanctuary state. That may now be no longer a live issue. But are there other issues that you think journalists should be looking at, Liz, that are really state specific or at least region specific?
I mean, look, the list that I gave you, there's a few federal things on there, but most of those are state issues, right? And I think that I'd recommended looking at things from national trends, but also you could take almost any one of those issues and dig into your state on that. What I would recommend doing is reaching out to the National Juvenile Justice Network member in your state, or the juvenile public defender in your state, and having this kind of conversation with them. Ask them, what are your top 10, or what are the things that I should be covering? And ask them to convene a group of advocates to talk with you. I mean, it's so easy to do it now over the web. I mean, I would recommend doing this same conversation with local folks. And if you have trouble getting in touch with anyone, I'd be happy to connect you all via email. But advocates in the states are hungry to talk to journalists who care about these issues. And so I don't think you have any problem getting a hold of them and having a similar conversation.
And of course, looking at solutions as well, right, Tina?
Yes.
So that's something.
Excuse me, Steve.
Yes.
Liz, what stories do you see coming out of a restructured Supreme Court? Supreme Court's played a pretty big role in the past in actually liberalizing the youth justice system. What stories would you suggest the reporters take a look at in regards to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, I put the Supreme Court on my list of the top 10 just for that very reason, because of this Mississippi case that was just heard. There's real concern in the community that we're going to go backwards, and that the new makeup of the court is going to reverse some of the recent rulings, half dozen rulings over the last 15 years, and go in the wrong direction. So I think that's a big story to watch for.
Are there specifics that you want to suggest that you're worried about, or just in general?
I mean, I'm concerned that they're going to rule in the wrong way in this Mississippi case, right? And that it'll undo some of what they've done in the past 15 years. That's what I'm most concerned about. I think advocates, people that I would suggest talking to on that, who I think would have a lot more to say about it, would be, the folks at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. They look at juvenile life without parole issues and extreme sentencing. I'd also talk to folks at the Sentencing Project, because they also follow those issues very closely. And again, what the court says really matters. You could also talk to folks at the local level who are, who may have cases that they may be bringing before the court as well. I think that if this case goes badly, I think that will put a big damper on legal advocacy.
Speaking of states, I wanted to bring up Mika Denny, who has a few things she mentioned in the question and answer section, some of the controversial programs that Utah is doing. So Mika, I'm going to give you the mic, if you can hear me. Yes, there she is, or he is.
Yep, I'm here.
I'm gender challenged today. So Mika, go ahead.
Nothing's been discussed so far about the different programs. A lot of them are in Utah, but there's others around the country. These like outward bound kind of programs or treatment centers, lockdown treatment centers. They're outside of, they're usually private, and parents sign their kids over to them. I'm wondering how that landscape fits into all the rest of this.
Micah, you raised a really good point, and I'm glad you mentioned that about Utah. I can't believe I didn't mention that when we were talking about Utah. There are a lot of these residential treatment centers that parents with means send their kids to when they get into trouble. And there have been a series of, scandals in these places. A lot of them happen to be located in Utah. I don't know what it is. Is it something in the water? Is it something in the state law? There's no oversight of these facilities. There were congressional hearings that George Miller, who represented the Bay Area in California, held about 15, 16 years ago. But there's been not much has happened since then. I think that the feds realized they didn't have a whole lot of oversight or control over them. So my understanding is that kids in the juvenile justice system typically don't end up in these facilities, but I think that there have been some cases of that. The states that, a lot of the states do not send kids out of state, but there are some states that do that. And, California is one of them. So I would, and these facilities in Utah tend to try to recruit kids from other states by, these nice brochures that make it look like they're going to go to Disney World and in this facility, and it turns out to be a different thing. But there is an advocacy group that is out there. I cannot remember their name off the top of my head, but I will get the name. I'll get it to Steve, and he can get it to you, because there are young people who've been in those programs who would have a lot to say about that issue and what happened to them.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions in our window. If anybody does want to raise their hand now, please do, or forever hold your peace. Of course, if you have questions afterwards that you think of, just send it to me via email, and I will get it to either of our two speakers. But otherwise, I want to thank both Liz and Tina for their time. It's been valuable. I think this kind of worked. The only thing we didn't have in this virtual roundtable is more interaction among all of you, and we're not sure how to get that going. We're still learning in Zoom, but I hope this roundtable worked well for you guys. And in fact, I hope the entire series has worked well. This is our closing session, as you know. I will be back to you, all of you, with emails for a sum up and to give you some more pointers and more information. And as I've said, keep tuned to our conference page. We'll have our videos recordings up from last week up shortly, and for this week, probably sometime next week. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that when you do your stories, which I hope you will, that you let us know either through links or just send us the PDF, and we will be delighted to post them, cross-post them on our site as well, so everybody else can see them, because that's part of what we do as a network in the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice. I don't know that there's anything else to say at this point, but as I said,
I do want to say,
Joe, do you have some?
I'd just like to thank Liz, always the smartest gal in the room, the smartest person in the room. Proves it again today, Liz. Thank you so much. You were just terrific.
And especially Tina, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay. We should have all for the last 5 weeks. It's been great, and wish you all well. Let's stay in touch. We can close out right now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.